So today we are going to talk about some basics of learning, and we will talk about associative learning, including behaviors models, and all the fun stuff. So what is learning? Learning is enduring changes in understanding of behavior that occur with experience. And learning can be very simple or very complex. This occurs when our information moves from the short-term memory to long-term memory. So a quick question, how do we learn? How do you guys learn? You can use any example. Go ahead.
By doing stuff.
Doing stuff? Any specific example?
I like mechanics. So
Mechanics?
Watching someone doing it is
Uh-huh.
good, but just doing it for myself and figuring it out is better.
Okay, all right, very good.
Like, I'm more of a auditory learner. Like, if you give me the option, like, read these textbooks or go to a lecture where they go over the chapters, I would rather go to the lecture and like listen to it and like
Okay.
follow along.
Okay, all right. Lucas? Yeah,
Oh, I'm more like a visual learner.
visual learner, so you watch stuff, okay. You have your hands up? No?
Just repetition.
Repetition?
Something.
Okay, very good. Okay, so you see we have a lot of different ways of learning, right? It's not like we only have one way to learn. So we can use experiencing events, like try to do it, try to experience it, and learn from it. We can observe relationship between events, such as watching, listening, etc. Those are just some basic examples. I will give you more examples coming up. So first, we have non-associative learning. This is the simplest form of learning. Orienting response. This term is referring to our immediate response to a change in the environment. Okay. And sensitization. This occurs when our reaction to a stimulus causes an increased reaction to a second stimulus. One example would be exaggerated startle response in trauma survivals. Yes?
It's like oriented response, like your reflexes, or like,
Kind of. You can say it's kind of like reflex.
or like when people say the first thing that comes to mind when I say blank.
Not really. So it's like, it's just your response to that stimulus. Okay? So, do you understand sensitization? No?
Can you give another example, please?
For example,
Oh, like, is it like, what's it called, like when you go like off into the army? What is that? Post-traumatic stress disorder, like.
oh, PTSD? Not quite, not quite. This is more like a simplest form. It's not as complex as PTSD, right? For example, if you get shocked by something the first time, you react like normally, right? And then the second time when you see it and you get shocked, you probably exaggerate that response. It's like your body is trying to help you prevent getting hurt again. So this means that the second time or the third time, your reaction is larger than the first time. Okay?
So like flinching is kind of be one, like a way of like an example, like
Which one?
for the sense.
Not really. Flinching is the first time if you flinch. That's orienting response.
Uh-huh.
But the second time when you flinch, like very exaggerated,
Yeah.
that will be sensitization.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay? Does that make sense now? Okay. Very good, very good. So after this, we have habituation. This occurs when we learn not to respond to a stimulus that is presented repeatedly without change. We also call this adapt to constant stimulation. So for example, when you go into a room and it smells bad, after a while you don't smell that anymore, right? So that's habituation. When you go to a place that has a lot of noises in the background, you first hear them, you can't focus, but after a while you start to tune out those noises. That's habituation. Okay? So you understand the difference between sensitization and habituation?
Mm-hmm.
Good? Okay, very good. We also have learning by repetition. Someone mentioned, yep. And one example will be practicing a skill. When you practice a piano or playing the guitar, you have to repeat that movement so that your muscle is used to that, right? So that's learning by repetition. And all of those will be non-associative learning right here. So they're very simple. Next, we have associative learning. This is the process of forming connections between pieces of information that are repeatedly linked together. For example, stereotypes. And we know stereotypes, they can be accurate sometimes, but a lot of times they are also not accurate. So we associate certain traits with a group of people that would be stereotypes. One example would be here, if you see a lot of black people playing basketball, you will have the stereotypes that black people are good at basketball, right? What other stereotypes people have, or you have heard of? There should be plenty. Yep.
Oh, white people can't cook.
Okay, I haven't heard of that before, but
yeah, I've
okay.
heard that one.
What else? There are a lot. You can just give me an example.
It's
Is
like kind of hard to say stereotypes because like.
You don't want to
you might
offend.
Yeah, like,
offend
you don't wanna
people?
offend anybody.
Oh, it's not your stereotypes, but the stereotypes that you have heard before.
Oh,
We need to talk about this. This is important, right? If everyone doesn't talk about it, we're not going to fix the issue, right? Yeah.
that like Mexicans are always doing yard work or like some type of work, like physical work like that.
Okay. Okay. Heard of that before? What else? There are a lot.
Somebody online said
Uh-huh.
Asians are smart.
Asians smart. They should get A's.
Not one.
That's why they call it the Asians.
Oh.
They're not Bejans. Yeah. Yep, heard that before.
Another one was Latino women are all feisty.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we hear a lot like stereotypes regarding minorities, right? What about majorities? White people. What are some stereotypes for white people?
White people can't dance.
Okay, they can't dance. Yep, heard that before. There are a ton of them,
Yeah,
right?
I'm trying to think of some.
When I talk about gun violence, and then someone holding a gun, what do you think of? Huh?
Definitely a white dude.
A white dude? Okay.
At least that's my opinion.
Okay. What about like gangsta? When I say gangsta movies, what do you think about
Black people.
black people?
Yeah.
You guys don't think that?
And that's the
Trying to
s-
be,
Like the mafia.
trying to,
Italian mob.
yeah,
Yeah.
mafia will be Italian, right? Gangsta will be black people. What else?
School shooter.
School shooters.
It's
You think
always-
of white people or black people? White people?
Black
Okay.
and white people.
Okay, so those are stereotypes, and there are a lot of them. And we know that for, I want to say the most part, I want to say a huge portion of them are not accurate. And we should talk about them so that we can know that they're not accurate. If people are not talking about them, you have your idea, you're not going to change that. So We are going to talk about stereotypes later on in social psychology, but now you just need to know that's a type of associative learning. If you see a lot of movies with black people holding a gun like this, and you're going to associate that, right? And then when you hear about rap songs talking about gun violence, and it's a black people who's singing it, and you're going to associate that. That's associative learning, right? Same with what you see on the media, where you listen to the news. So be very careful what you are absorbing from the environment. A lot of information could be biased. Okay. Okay. So in associative learning, we have the behaviors models. So both classical conditioning and operant conditioning. I'm going to go over that. So classical conditioning, this is the learning based on repeated pairing between stimuli. We have the unconditioned stimulus. This is the stimulus that elicits an innate, unlearned response. So for example, when a baby is hungry and I show the baby food, they will salivate. That's an unconditioned stimulus. They don't need to learn that. And then neutral stimulus will be a stimulus that does not elicit any particular response on its own. For example, if you never seen this before, and I just put it in front of your face, you're not going to react to it, right? You don't know what this is. So that will be a neutral stimulus. It's not innate. Okay? How many of you heard of Pavlov's dogs? Okay. Does it ring a bell?
Is it the dogs that is it the dogs that like talk with like buttons?
No, not really. If you didn't get that joke, you get it. Okay, so I'm going to show you a video of what Pavlov's dogs means and what kind of experiments this is.
Do you ever find yourself salivating when you sit down to a tasty dinner? According to learning theorists, this biological response to a tasty plate of grub could be a learned behavior, learned via a process called classical conditioning. Let's go back a sec. We didn't know how to salivate until we learned it? No, that's not quite it. Otherwise, babies would have even more on their plates in the first year of life. Salivating is an automatic process that makes up part of the digestive system. The learned element of this behavior is that you don't need to eat a cake to start salivating anymore. You could simply look at a cake. Better still, you could just think of a cake. The first person to apply the example of salivation to classical conditioning was the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov. That's why another term for classical conditioning is Pavlovian conditioning. And it was discovered by accident. Pavlov was conducting research on dogs' gastric systems when he noticed that the doggy participants would start salivating when they heard or smelt food in eager anticipation of feeding. Testing this observation further, Pavlov found that if he played a sound to the dogs before feeding, soon enough the dogs would start salivating to this otherwise neutral stimulus alone. Here's what's happening in diagrammatical form. Before conditioning, an unconditioned stimulus, the food, produces an unconditioned response, salivation. That's reflexive biology. However, during conditioning, a neutral stimulus, such as the ringing of a bell, and the original unconditioned stimulus become associated with each other. This is a learned association. The neutral stimulus predicts the unconditioned stimulus, which causes an unconditioned response. The neutral stimulus gradually becomes a conditioned stimulus, which produces a conditioned response, even if the original unconditioned stimulus isn't present. It's easy to see lots of applications of this learning theory in day-to-day life. It's not just relevant to dogs. In fact, early attachment theorists had a theory of cupboard love, which suggested that babies form attachments with their parents because they are a neutral stimulus that provides food, which gives the baby pleasure. The cupboard love theory of parental attachment has gone out of fashion somewhat, but an experimental study by Watson and Rayner showed that human phobias can be learned through classical conditioning. The 1920 Little Albert study, which would probably not be permitted today on ethical grounds, saw the researchers create a phobia of white rats in an 11-month-old baby, simply by slamming a hammer against a steel bar after baby Albert had looked at a white rat. Albert subsequently demonstrated a phobia of all white fluffy objects, including Santa Claus. Combined, the two studies presented in this video show that classical conditioning can be used for better or for worse. An interesting question remains: as adults, are we still so easily manipulated?
Okay. So you get the idea of what classical conditioning means, right? Okay. All right. Pretty good. So in this case, the unconditioned stimulus will be the meat. This is unlearned, right? The dog doesn't need to learn that meat is tasty. They just want to eat it. And then the neutral stimulus would be the bell. That shouldn't elicit any response in dogs if it hasn't been paired with any unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response is dogs salivate to meat powder. Okay, so that's pairing with this. And then the conditioned response will be the dogs begin to salivate to the bell alone. So after you pair the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus for long enough, the unconditioned response will become conditioned response to the bell. Okay, I'll give you more example if it's a bit confusing right now. Okay, so in a classical conditioning process, before conditioning, this is unlearned, and you can call it the reflex. The unconditioned stimulus elicits an unconditioned response. So in this case, will be meat elicit a response of salivating. And then during the conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus is paired with the neutral stimulus. And then the unconditioned stimulus occurs. So in this example will be meat is pairing with bell, and the dog salivates to the meat, not to the bell, even though they're paired together. So after conditioning, this is learned behavior. The bell becomes a conditioned stimulus. So salivation occurs in response to the bell alone, and then salivation becomes a conditioned response when there's a bell occur. Okay. Is it confusing or is it okay? Okay.
So condition means it's been practiced, and then unconditioned means it just happens with a stimulation.
It means it's unlearned.
It's unlearned.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. If you have questions, let me know. So here's an example of classical conditioning. So passionate kiss will elicit sexual arousal, right? That should be unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response, right? You don't need to learn that. No one teaches that in school, right? And then if your romantic partner has onion breath, that's conditioned stimulus plus the unconditioned stimulus. And then every time when you kiss, you smell onion breath, but you still get sexually aroused. And after conditioning, when you smell the onion breath alone, you feel sexually aroused. So that will be the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's an example in human. All right, here is another example. You guys seen the show Office, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is an example from that.
Oh, damn, lost another file. Gonna have to reboot again. Hey, Dwight, do you want an Altoid?
What do you think?
In school, we learned about this scientist who trained dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell by feeding them whenever a bell rang. So for the past couple weeks, I've been conducting a similar experiment. Dwight, one output.
Okay.
Altoid?
Sure.
And Dwight?
Blueprint? Yes.
What are you doing? What?
I don't know. Well, my mouth tastes so bad all of a sudden. Ugh.
All right. You got it? Okay. All right. So, questions. In the example of the office, what is the unconditioned stimulus? Is it the computer sound or the Altoids? Okay, very good. So, the Altoids. What is the neutral stimulus, or after conditioning becoming the conditioned stimulus in this example?
Computer sound.
Okay, very good, very good. So you guys got it. So step one, before conditioning, Altoid will be the unconditioned stimulus. Hands out or salivating will be the unconditioned response. But the computer noise should not elicit this hands out response. So that will be the neutral stimulus. Step two, I forgot his name. The guy who's conditioning. Huh? Jim. Oh yeah, Jim. So Jim was trying to condition. While the conditioning, he is pairing computer noise and Altoids. And then he will get a response from Dwight. And after that, the computer noise becomes the conditioned stimulus.
And then he also makes it like it calling that his mouth tastes bad. Is that also like a
That's a conditioned response. I put hands out here, but it should be hands out and salivate, or I don't know. Okay, so any examples in life? You get this joke?
Yeah.
Okay, what about examples in your life? Can you think of any?
If I say I'm gonna go outside and I go to put my shoes on, my dog will wait by the door.
Okay, very good, very good. So that's classical conditioning. I'm going to show you some other examples. Commercials. You see sexuality or provocative imagery pairing with perfumes, cars, watches, right? They're trying to make you have that conditions whenever you smell perfume, when you see a watch, you should associate that with sexy. And you want to buy that. Does that make sense? That's how a commercial works.
So what like the idea of like how like society's kind of been trained to think like the color blue is for men and the color pink is for women. That used to not be the case. Or that's more just like different.
It could be. It could be. It's not as obvious. It's not trying to elicit like a response, but you're pairing them together and then you associate it together. Okay. Also, like beers, you see a lot of beers commercial with sexy lady because they want men to buy beer, right? Okay. And then John B. Watson, he's an American psychologist. He thinks that he can train any healthy baby to do anything. Do you remember him?
Yeah, we talked about him at the beginning.
Yeah. So according to him, he can use this classical conditioning to train any babies into a president, a cook, a teacher, a thief, a killer, like anything. He thinks that he can do that. So little Albert, you remember that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So before conditioning, the loud noise will be the unconditioned stimulus. The crying is the unconditioned response because it scares him. And then the rats, does not elicit any particular emotions, so it would be the neutral stimulus. So he was not afraid of the rats before. During conditioning, Watson paired the loud noise and the rat together. Little Albert learned to fear rats after that. Okay. Wait, hold on. Okay, I'll just go over this. So there are some additional principles in classical conditioning. So stimulus generalization is when you have unconditioned stimulus with conditioned stimulus pairing generalized to stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus. For example, in that video, it talks about little Albert is afraid of Santa Claus after he learned to fear rats, right? Because Santa Claus has white, furry thing here. So he will be learned to scare of rats and many other small fluffy things such as rabbits. Next, we have stimulus discrimination. That's when the new stimuli is different enough from the conditioned stimulus that it does not elicit a response. For example, little Albert might not be afraid of polar bear because it's so much larger than the rats, and he can distinguish that. So that would be stimulus discrimination. Extinction. This is the gradual disappearance of the conditioned response. When the conditioned response keeps occurring without the unconditioned stimulus. Okay, I'm going to show you example. Oh, it's not here, but let's say the loud noise is not paired with the rats anymore, and little Albert keeps seeing the rats, but without the loud noise. He will not cry when he sees the rats once that conditioning is extinguished. Okay, so that's extinction. Recondition is the quick learning of the conditioned response after extinction. So little Albert will quickly learn to fear rats again when Watson paired the rats with the loud noise again after extinction. So you can, even after you forget about that pair, you can pick it up quicker than the first time. Okay, so that's the reconditioning. The spontaneous recovery, this is the reappearance of the conditioned response after extinction. And here's a graph to kind of help you demonstrate. So first, acquisition is when you learn about the pairing, and then extinction is when you kind of forget about the pairing. Let's say. So after a period of time, you will have this spontaneous recovery. So you gain that pairing, or you learn that pairing again much faster than the first time. And then extinction is when you forget that pairing again. Mm-hmm.
So like going like with the dogs, if the dogs kept on seeing the food without the bell or seeing the bell without the food, they can lose that act of whenever they hear the bell, they'll accelerate. But if you try to teach them again, they'll learn quicker.
Yep.
Is it like the same idea as like when you haven't like picked up a guitar in a long time and you try learning it again, you kind of like pick up, you learn quicker?
That's different.
Okay.
So that's not classical conditioning. That's repetition. Okay, question. Was the Watson treatment of little Albert ethical? No? Yep, of course not. Little Albert died a couple years after the experiments. Do you think most behaviors are reactions to the environment or expressions of personality traits, beliefs, values, and other personal characteristics, or a mix of both person and the environment?
I think it makes it both.
Both? Yeah, very good. Very good. Should be person and environment. So applications, how we use classical conditioning in real life. They have trained animals to detect explosives. So dogs and honeybees are trained to react a certain way when they smell explosives. and they can detect smells much better than humans, so we use that. And I'm going to show you a clip how bumblebee works. But you know that we also talked about PTSD.
Yeah.
It's like phobias can work in classical conditioning as well. So you can develop phobias through classical conditioning.
So would you say like fears are also a type of like proverb? Like learning? I forgot the word.
No.
Okay.
So there are different types of learning, different types of fear as well. Okay.
If you were making a film about bees taking over the world, this might be how the opening scene would look. But honeybees like these could soon be helping to make the world a safer place. Scientists at Sentinel in Harpenden near Luton want to use bees' highly developed sense of smell to sniff for explosives.
We first expose them to, say, TNT smell. At that moment, you touch the antenna of honeybee with some sugar water. Then, as a reflex, they stick out their tongue because they think, in front of me is sugar water. And when the bees detect the presence of explosive, they stick out their tongue. And that response of tongue sticking out will then be translated into a signal that our LCD display will display.
They're still carrying out tests to demonstrate its effectiveness, but Mr. Hu has been in talks with companies that handle the security of freight at Heathrow Airport.
Just like dogs are trained by policemen to detect explosive in the airports. We do the same with bees, but faster and much more cost effective.
The number of wild bees in Britain has been in decline. Robin Dartington runs the Buzzworks Community Bee Garden in Hitchin. He's welcomed this new use for the insects.
Everything that bees does for mankind will help mankind do things back for bees. And bees at the moment do have very severe problems in the wild. And we do need a lot of people giving them help.
Some people might think that it looks cruel to the bees.
The condition of bees is the ultimate factor of whether our detector is working. If animals are feeling uncomfortable, they won't serve well as a sensor.
As part of a hive, these worker bees would hunt tirelessly for pollen. In the detector, they'd sniff for 2 days before being set free. So it's really just a very short secondment.
I don't know, I still don't like it. It's just not natural to me. But so you get how it works, right?
That's crazy.
Okay, so question. John moves to a new apartment. He is in the shower when he hears his son flush the toilet. The water becomes extremely hot and John jumps. After a few flushes during the showers, John notices that he's fearful and flinches whenever he hears a toilet flushing. That fear he experiences when he hears a toilet is what kind of? The conditioned response?
Yeah.
Okay, very good, very good. Okay. Soon John notices a change in his behavior. Now he also experiences fear when he hears water running through pipes. The new fear is most consistent with the learning principle known as which one?
B.
B. Okay. Very good. Stimulus generalization. So generalizing to a similar stimulus. Okay. John has had enough. He decides to ask his son to flush the toilet as many times a day as possible when John is not showering. So which procedure is John attempting to perform on himself?
C.
Okay. Right. Okay, very good. Extinction. So they're now pairing them together. Okay, so after classical conditioning, let's talk about operant conditioning. This is the famous guy for doing this is the B.F. Skinner. He's also an American psychologist. This is the learning based on the consequences of your behavior, which alters your future decisions. So it's a little bit different from classical conditioning. Skinner developed a Skinner's box. This is when they have an animal in a box, and then they learn certain behavior when they get rewards. So they will learn some movements that's not natural in the natural environment. Okay. Here I'm going to show you how that works.
Can pigeons read? This one gives every indication, because he's been taught to distinguish between two words and to behave appropriately. He's learned his different response to each sign by being rewarded with food. So the bird isn't acting independently. Its behavior is shaped by controlling its environment. The first task was to isolate an individual piece of behavior and see how that could be changed. Skinner did this by keeping individual pigeons at about 3/4 of their normal weight, so that the birds were always hungry, and food could be used as an automatic reward. The pigeon was studied in a uniform box, one it quickly grew used to. One piece of behavior, pecking a coloured disc, was measured on a graph. The pigeon learned that pecking the disc produced a reward. Then the behavior of pecking could be studied in relation to how often that reward was offered, or in Skinner's terms, what was the schedule of reinforcement.
The main thing is what we call schedules of reinforcement. Reinforcement is what the layman calls reward, and you can schedule it so that a reward occurs every now and then when a pigeon does something. We usually use a response with a pigeon pecking a little disc, a little spot in the wall, and you can reinforce with food, but you don't reinforce every time. Perhaps every 10th time, or perhaps only once every minute or something like that. There are a very large number of schedules, and they have their special effects. And there is a good example of how you can move from the pigeon to the human case, because...
Okay, so do you get the idea how they train? I will teach you about shaping, hopefully in next class. So it's kind of still hard to understand how they train the pigeon to do certain moves, right? But I will show you how they do it exactly. That's called shaping, and we'll talk about that later. Okay, so here's an example in real life.
Are you finished?
Well, thank you. How thoughtful. Would you like a chocolate?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Oh, sorry, Sheldon. I almost sat in your spot.
Did you? I didn't notice. Have a chocolate.
Thank you.
You're here a lot now.
Oh, am I talking too much? I'm sorry. Zip.
Thank you. Chocolate?
Yes, please. Oh, hey, Kim. Yeah, you know what? Hold on. Let me take this in the hall. You'll never guess who they got to replace you at work.
Okay. I know what you're doing.
Really?
Yes. You're using chocolates as positive reinforcement for what you consider correct behavior.
Alright, so you get the idea, right?
So it's like how dogs are trained basically to do like tricks and stuff.
Yes. For some of them. Yep, it's not all the time, but some of them. He said positive reinforcement, but that's not really accurate. We're going to talk about that. Okay, so in operant conditioning, the basic is that we learn based on the consequences of our behavior. Okay? So for example, when you have good consequences, you will tend to repeat that behavior. That will be reinforcement. Let's say when you answer questions in class, when you ask questions, I give you good feedback. I say good job, good question, something like that. You're more likely to ask questions, right? However, if you get bad consequences, you're not likely to repeat that behavior. So that will be punishment. So if you ask questions, and I was like, that's dumb, why would you ask that? You're not going to ask me questions anymore, right? So that will be punishment. So make sure you know reinforcement and punishment. One is increasing the behavior, the other one is decreasing the behavior. Okay, reinforcer. This is anything that makes a behavior more likely to occur in the future. For primary reinforcers, those will meet our basic needs. So those are like food, water, etc. For secondary reinforcers, that will be something that's pleasant, like dessert, money, etc. Okay, so you just need to know there's a difference between primary reinforcer and secondary reinforcer. Punishment is anything that makes a behavior less likely to occur in the future. Positive means that you're adding a stimulus. And then negative is you're removing a stimulus. So this could be a little confusing because usually we say positive is something good, negative is something bad. You need to throw that out of the window.
So you could have a negative reinforcement then?
Yeah, I'm going to show you a graph, a table. So make sure you know positive is adding something, negative is taking away something. Okay, so here is a box to help you remember. First, we have positive reinforcement. So you're adding a stimulus to increase that behavior. Usually, you're adding a pleasant stimulus. For example, payment, food rewards, feelings of pleasure that accompany certain activities, such as drugs, exercise, and sex. So you get this good feeling, or you get a reward, you're more likely to do that behavior again, right? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that's positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is you removing a stimulus to increase that behavior. So usually that stimulus is unpleasant. For example, breaks and vacation, you're removing yourself from the work environment. And you're more likely to work hard so that you can remove yourself again from the work environment. Right? So that's removing something. Get rid of unpleasant sounds, smells, and tastes. When you drive a car and you don't put on your seatbelt, you have that annoying beeping sound, right? So when you put on your seatbelt, it takes away that annoying sound. That's removing that stimulus, and you're more likely to put on your seatbelt. So that's a negative reinforcement. Okay? Next, positive punishment. That's you're adding an unpleasant stimulus to decrease the behavior. For example, physical punishment like spanking, and then kids or your pets will not likely to do that again because they don't like that. Negative feedback like disapproval, scolding, you're adding something so that people don't like it and they don't do it again. Okay? And spraying the cats when they're doing something that you don't like. Okay? So that's positive punishment. Negative punishment is you're removing a pleasant stimulus. For example, they get grounded, so you're removing their freedom. The loss of privilege, they can get like a good meal if they behave good. If they don't behave well, you take away that good meal, you let them eat crappy stuff. That's negative punishment. Okay? Withholding food, sex, money, and other rewards. So those are some examples for negative punishment. Does that help? Okay, good. Make sure you go over that so that you don't get confused when I give you examples. Okay, so we have 4 minutes. Do you have any questions? No? Okay, let's do some practice questions together. Just make sure you get it. A child has his favorite crayons taken away for fighting with his sister. What is this? Taking away the crayon.
Negative punishment.
Negative punishment. Very good. Okay. If you don't get it, you can go back to the table and it help you understand. A dolphin gets a fish for doing a trick.
Positive reinforcement.
Okay. Very good. So here, have you seen this? Go watch this. This is Oscar winner in that year. It's the best documentary. It's really good. Highly recommended. all the other movies that I recommended. You don't have to watch that, but watch this. This is awesome. A puppy's choke collar is loosened when the dog walks closer to its trainer. What is this?
Negative reinforcement.
What do you guys think?
Negative reinforcement.
What about other people? So
I
the
think it's a punishment. I feel like it's a positive punishment.
okay, so you think it's a punishment? Okay, can you explain?
Well, it's more like the choke collar happens whenever they don't walk close to their trainer. So
Wait, is that how I phrased here?
I guess it's not how you phrased it, yeah.
Okay, so something is loosened, right? And then something is taken away, right? So it should be negative reinforcement. When you walk closer to the trainer, that's you're reinforcing that behavior, right? And then you loosen the collar, so you're taking something away, the pressure away. Okay? You see how you can like over assumed. Okay? A convicted criminal is sent to prison. This is the tricky one.
Negative punishment.
Anyone else? No one? Okay, can you explain why this is negative punishment?
You're taking the person out of society for doing something bad.
Did I say I'm taking this person out?
Well, it's a prison, like it's convicted
It can
prison.
also be a positive reinforcer if they're in a bad situation outside of prison. So it really depends. on whether-
Did I talk about bad environment outside of prison? Wait, there is way to tell. Just use the information that I gave you here. Yes.
Would it be positive punishment because the prison is like being added and it's like for him doing something bad?
Very good. Very good. So it should be positive punishment. So prison is added to this person, right? You're adding that stimulus. And then punishment is you're taking away the freedom. Does that make sense?
I thought that's what made it negative, because you're taking away their freedom.
Yeah, that's how I saw it too. Like you're putting
So I should have phrased that. So punishment is not taking away, it's decreasing the behavior. So they're not likely to commit a crime again. Does that make sense? So it's not like you're adding the prison to make them to do that again, right? It should be you're adding the stimulus to decrease the criminal behavior. Okay? Okay, so don't use any information that's not in the question. Very good. Okay. Okay, so the child gets dessert after eating her vegetables.
reinforcement.
Very good, very good. So you're getting something for doing something good, and you're more likely to do that again. The car buzzer turns off when you put on your seatbelt.
Negative reinforcement.
All right. The driver's speeding results in a ticket and a fine.
Positive punishment.
Positive punishment. You guys agree? Okay, good. So I think you guys kind of got it. Just make sure you don't assume stuff that's not in the question. That's it. If you don't have any questions, I will see you on Wednesday.
Prison.